Now in this video, we're going to talk about something called race conditions. Now I left this in intentionally when we did some coding earlier, and I actually thought it was going to happen and pop up a lot earlier than it took for this to actually happen. So you may not have even had that error happen in the last video, and that's kind of the point of showing it like this. So it can sometimes happen and it sometimes won't. It's something you have to factor in when you're making your game, because it's a hard bug to troubleshoot in the fact that it doesn't always happen. So until you actually run and start playtesting your game a lot, you may or may not have it happen. This one's a bit tricky when you're starting out, but I want to show it fairly early because this can happen all the time in your game. Now what this is called a race condition. And what's happening here is, let me demonstrate, I'll see if it happens again here. And this is the thing with race conditions, is sometimes they'll happen, sometimes they won't. So when I loaded this level, everything worked, I didn't get an error. Now I'm going to try to get to the next level, and hopefully that happens again. Okay, so it did happen here. So if I stop the game, I'm getting the variable current player of game manager has not been assigned. So when we start getting errors like this, you notice I have two errors. So we want to start with the first one, because a lot of the time getting one error is going to cause errors after it. So usually the way you want to work this is look at the first error and figure that out first. And in this case, if I fix the first error, the second error is going to go away. So it's trying to tell me what the issue is here. It says unassigned reference exception. The variable current player of game manager has not been assigned. You probably need to assign the current player variable in the inspector. So in this case, if we look at our game manager, we don't actually have current player public because we hit it, and we're not assigning it in the inspector at all. We do it in code. So we need to find out why current player here, basically what this error is saying, it says it has not been assigned. So it's saying this current player doesn't exist. So we can see it's the camera controller that also gave an error. So what this is telling me is on our main camera here, this variable player doesn't exist when the game loads the next scene. So if we look at our camera controller, let's follow the logic of how this is working. So when our camera controller loads in start, it's going to assign into player the game manager.current player. So we have to kind of trace this step by step. So we want to start here. This is the first step, is it's going to do this. So let's go and look at game manager.current player. So if we go to game manager, we have current player here. And then let's follow our code. We need to see where is current player. So in spawn player, when we spawn the player, we instantiate it and we assign it into current player. So what this leads me to believe is if current player has nothing in it, there's a problem right here. And that's in our spawn player method. So we can see we call this method in start, so everything should be working. As soon as we start our game, we spawn the player and we should have them. Now what's actually happening here, as I mentioned, it's called a race condition. And the reason it's called that is because these two methods are racing against each other. So you can see we have spawn player in the start method of game manager. And if we go to player, if we go to camera controller, we're trying to get the player in start. So the thing is, when Unity runs all of our scripts, it runs through all the methods in order. So every start for every game object is going to run before it starts running other things like update. But the order that they run in is not always the same. So what's going to happen here is sometimes it works, and that's because when it works, that means the game manager, its start method ran first, and then the camera controller method ran its start after. But that order is not always the exact same. So if we load a new level and the camera controller start tries to run first before the game manager, when this code runs, it's going to search for the game manager, and then it's going to take the current player and assign it to this player. But if this current player on Game Manager has not run yet, which means it didn't create it, this player is going to have nothing in it. So this is something very common that happens a lot. You have to plan the order of how your scripts are going to run this. We actually have something built in that fixes this for us. So on our Game Manager, because we want to make sure this stuff is always done first before any other scripts do it, instead of using start, we actually have one that runs before start, and it's called awake. So you can think of awake as soon as this script becomes alive, awake is going to run. So all of the awakes on every script in your game is going to run before any single start method runs. So now this should fix the problem because this is always going to run before the camera controller. So let's try this out and see if this fixed the error for us. Okay, so that level was good. And again, this is a bit hard to test because we're not going to know until we play the game quite a bit if it actually worked. Because I could get lucky here and that one just worked. But so far so good. I'm going to try this one and I'll try one more. Okay, so that's working. The way you usually want to do it is something like a game manager where you're getting things right at the start. You can use awake to make sure they're done really early before anything else. Okay, so everything's working there now, and I will see you in the next video. In this video, we're going to start adding some hazards into our game. So we did start working on a rock before. We're going to work with spikes in this video. But we're going to set it up so that we can add any hazard in without having to do different code changes or different modifications. So the player is going to treat any hazard the same, regardless if it's spikes or some lava on the floor or whatever we want here. So we treated water separate just because we might want to do some different behavior with water. But any other object on the ground, we're going to treat the same. So let's go into our tiles pack again here. And if we look, we do have a spike sprite here. So we have these spikes. So now on our tile maps, we want to add a new tile map. So I'm going to do 2D object, tile map, rectangular. I'm just going to call this hazards tile map because it's not just going to be spikes. It can be anything else we put on it. Now for sorting layer, I'm just going to use items because I already have that. So even though they're different than something like our exit sign, we want them treated at the same layer. So they want to be on top of everything except for the player. The player will go on top of the hazards. So if we just use that same layer we already have, it's going to work just fine. Now, we only have spikes right now, but in case we want to add a bunch of different hazards later, or even just items, I'm going to make a new palette for them. And instead of just calling it spikes or hazards, I'm going to make it items, because any other items I add in here, we want to be on the same kind of palette. So I'm just going to call it items palette. So this can include good items, bad items, anything we want, just so they're all grouped together. Okay, so I'm going to drag the spikes on here. And now you can see if I start adding these like switches or jump platforms, any stuff like that, I can use this same palette, so it's very easy to use. Okay, and I'm just going to take care of it right now. I'm just going to add the colliders. Okay, I'm going to set the rigid body to static. Okay, and we want to use composite. Okay, and we also want to set this as a trigger. So we don't want to stop right on the spikes, we want to fall into them, and then we tell our player to respawn or play an animation, whatever we want to do there. Okay, so now we have this and we can just paint in our spikes whenever we want them. So if we select this one with the paint, we're on the hazards tile map layer. Now we can just start painting. So, oh, and we noticed we forgot to do something here. So if you look how funny looking it is. And if you can figure that out, you should be able to at this point, but it's because we forgot to change the pixels per unit. So again, these are 128. But the nice thing with Unity with this is if you do forget to do this, you don't have to go back and correct all the items you drew. It's going to fix all of that for us. So if we change this to 128, hit apply, everything existing is going to be corrected. Okay, so we have this. Oh, I accidentally painted one there, so I need to erase that. Let's brush again. So I'm going to put 2 there. I'll put 1 here. And I'll put 2 here as well. So just something in here so we can test it out. These levels obviously aren't very nice looking levels right now. I'm going to make mine better later. Yours probably look much better than mine at this point. Okay, so we have this set up. Now if we select our hazards tile map, we can just make a tag for this whole layer. So I'm just going to add tag. I'm just going to call it hazard. So if we go back to hazards, we can set a tag for hazard. So that's most of the work right there. All we really have to do is just go into our player controller. We can just copy this else if statement. And we can just change the tag to hazard. And there we go. This should work. We can test it right away. And I just want to mention, this does look fairly repetitive that all of these are calling player died. But having it set up where we are calling them separate, even though right now we're calling the exact same player died method, in the future this allows us, if we want to change how the player interacts when it hits the kill box, or it hits the water, or it hits the hazards, we can do something different. So in this case, I could call a different method, or I can still call the player died method, but before I call it, I could tell the player to do something specific. So I could do something like tell it to play a splash animation in here before it dies. And then if we hit a hazard, we could tell it to play, you know, a death animation or something else in there that's different. So this allows us a bit of freedom here. So let's go test to make sure this works. Okay, so we hit a spike and we respawned. Again, it's very abrupt and we don't really have any kind of feedback to the player that he died. We're going to work on that later. But there we go. So now we have some hazards that are working. So feel free to find some additional hazards besides spikes and add them in on that same layer and they should work for you. Okay, I will see you in the next video.